So I'm trying something new this evening. This may be the preferred method of preaching throughout Holy Week. So what does preaching look like during a time of social distancing? During a time when we can't do church the way that we're used to doing church? And to me, Holy Week, all of these services today and what's coming up are the climax of the Christian year, the Christian calendar. And if Palm Sunday doesn't mean anything for me while I'm sitting on my porch during a time of profound social isolation and global crisis, then it doesn't mean anything at all. And if Palm Sunday only means something in church on a Sunday morning, it doesn't mean anything at all. And so this evening, I'm inviting you onto my porch with me. Bundle up, it's a little bit chilly. You'll hear an owl in the background. My spouse is Zooming with some friends on the other side of this wall. You'll probably hear her laughter, catching up with old friends. But I invite you to come into this space with me to reflect on the meaning of Palm Sunday and to go beyond just the normal kind of Sunday school type answers, but to think about, what is Palm Sunday? What is Jesus coming to Jerusalem? What is Jesus specifically coming to the temple? What does that mean? Not just in church, but on our porches, in our homes, in our lives, in this current time right now. To me, God is the most obvious thing in the world. Now, I know that this may seem like a blessing if God is so obvious, but it's actually a bit of a curse. God can be so obvious that we actually spend a lot of our lives overlooking him, looking right past him. I'm reminded of Andy Bernard's one of his final lines, if not his last line, in the final episode of The Office, where he said, "I wish that somebody could tell you when you're living in the good old days, while you're actually in them." He was reflecting on his time in the office and the relationships that he had made and the friendships that have gone quite deep, and he was lamenting the fact that it was all coming to an end. There are so many times in life where we feel this exact same way, where we don't recognize the good old days while we're actually in them. But when we come out of these seasons, we recognize that there's so much that we missed out on, so many things that we regret not being more aware of while we were going through these times of life. So often we can overlook the great things that are right in front of our faces because we're too preoccupied with other things. And in many ways, I think these other things, we would agree, are not the primary important things in life, but things that tend to distract us, things that we feel like we've actually wasted time on. And in life, it's hard to see the forest for the trees. When Jesus came into Jerusalem, he wept. He knew that God's people had missed out on God's coming to them. He actually says this in the verse that we read for this evening. They couldn't see what was right in front of their very eyes. And as Jesus entered the temple, he started flipping over the tables of the money changers and the salespeople. And he shouted out that this house should be a house of prayer, but you all have made it into a den of robbers. Now, there's different ways to interpret the story, and some of the kind of popular ways that I've heard preached and told over the years, in many ways, the ways I've preached this story too, was that when Jesus was coming to the temple, he was fulfilling a prophecy. There was a prophecy where God would come and cleanse the temple, renew it, restore it, make it holy once again. And in many ways, Jesus is fulfilling that prophecy And then there's another interpretation which talks about how these money changers had set up shop in the only place in the temple where outsiders, where people who were from foreign countries, where the culturally marginalized could come and pray. The court of the Gentiles, as they called it, the outer courts. And so then thus the interpretation becomes this, that God really does care for the marginalized and the outsiders. That's why Jesus came cracking a whip at the people who were oppressing these folks as they were trying to pray. But again, I think the obvious thing escapes us when we just focus on these things. I think the obvious meaning is this. This should be a house of prayer, but you've made it into a den of thieves, a den of robbers. People were being robbed of their experience of God in that space by those money changers. And it's not too blunt to say that this whole scene actually really pissed Jesus off, intensely so. One of the gospel stories actually says that he made a whip. He literally made a whip, fashioned a whip, and started swinging at the people who were in the temple courts, these money changers, these salesmen, and probably a few priests and religious teachers as well. And this is really interesting to think about if you take a moment just to pause and reflect on this story. Then in every other way, Jesus was a peaceful activist. Jesus was not the Messiah who was going to lead his people into military victory over Rome, even though people urged him to do so. And Jesus was not the Messiah who was going to smite people with thunderbolts or anything like that from heaven. He wasn't going to smite those who sought to crucify him. But Jesus was the Messiah who would kick some ass when the religious powers that be, the religious institution, robbed people of their experience of God. And that's worth pondering. It's worth reflecting on. But I imagine that a great many of you out there are a lot like me. I mean, these interpretations of this particular passage, they're great and all, and there's dozens of others for sure. I mean, it's helpful to know that when Jesus came into the temple and started swinging a whip around, he was fulfilling an ancient prophecy. He was cleansing the temple, so to speak. It was a way of God manifesting God's presence in a cleansing, restorative, remedial type of way. You know, and for me personally, it's really touching, meaningful to think about how much Jesus cared about the Gentiles and about the outsiders who were trying to pray in the temple courts, and how infuriated he got when those people were being robbed of their experience of God by people, the money changers, by the sales folks, by probably a few priests and a few religious leaders. But if you're like me, I don't want to just know about what happened back then. I don't want to know just about what this story meant to people back then. I want to know about what this story means right now. What does this story mean for me as I sit out on my porch, as I hear cars go by, as I hear an owl in a tree nearby? What does this story mean when I'm not in church, not in the middle of the liturgical event, not around all of the churchy people who buy into the same belief system that I do, or close to it? What does this story mean for all of us as a pandemic sweeps across our globe, as people suffer, as people die? What does this story mean for me after a few weeks of social isolation and social distancing? I don't want to just know about what Jesus did back then. I want to know about what Jesus is doing right here, right now. And I think that's the question that this story leaves us with. What is the meaning of this passage right here, right now? Where is Jesus right now? Where is he swinging a whip right now? Where is he exuding all of this passion, all of this energy? Where is he caring for the oppressed and the marginalized? Where is the temple? Where are the money changers and the sales folks and the religious powers that be that blessed the whole endeavor to distract people from prayer? Again, I think that the obvious meaning escapes a great many of us. Elsewhere in the New Testament and the early church had this idea that God's people are God's temple. And this temple that Jesus went into and started swinging a whip in Jerusalem, it no longer stands. It's not here anymore. It was destroyed. And Jesus actually warned them of this in the passage that we read tonight. But that physical building is no longer God's temple. I'm not sure it really ever was. But it's clear, according to the scriptures, according to the Christian tradition, that we are God's temple, that we are God's home, God's abode. This physical thing that I call my body is where God dwells. It's where God rests. The divine presence dwells within us. And like that temple, we all have these distracting thoughts, these things that get in the way, that hinder our ability to experience the divine presence, hinder our ability to wake up to the divine presence, hinder our ability to understand that God is the most obvious thing in the world. God is the being that we all live and move and have our being in, according to Paul. But we're too busy thinking about other things to really notice most of the time, or at all. And I think the key for this passage, for me at least, is to look at the passage through a mystical lens. We ought to recognize that God has come, that in Jesus Christ God has visited, that God is still in our midst, and God has never left our midst, that God is with us, that God is the most obvious thing in the world. But I think the other key to understanding this passage, and actually taking something very meaningful and transformative away from it, is that we need to let Jesus take the whip. We all have these distracting thoughts that flood us, things that our minds are preoccupied with, things that take our attention, pull our mindfulness out of everyday life and everyday situations. And in many ways, I think over the years I've learned that the more that I try to combat these thoughts, suppress them, push them down, push them out, the more it actually hinders things. The more distracted I become, because then I get ticked off that I can't actually get rid of the thoughts that are plaguing me. And so not only do I have thoughts that are plaguing me, but I'm mad that I have thoughts that are plaguing me, and I'm mad that I can't do anything about it. But I think the key to Christian spirituality, and the key to actually understanding this passage, again, is that we have to let Jesus take the whip. We have to let Jesus do the driving out. We have to let Jesus make the space holy, the temple holy. God is the one who comes in, whip a-crackin', driving out those mental versions of whatever your money changers are. Whatever that line of thought is in your head that you have to acquire something in order to gain God's approval. I have to acquire this certain thing to sacrifice it in order to have God's love, God's blessing. Jesus comes in and drives it out. And Jesus comes in and drives out all of those voices, those religious, pessimistic, negative, judgmental voices that tell you that you're not good enough, that you don't deserve to be in God's space, that you don't deserve to be praying to the Holy One, that you deserve to be distracted, that you deserve to feel as though God is not really listening to you. It's the furthest thing from the truth. The best thing we can do in response to this story, the way of responding to this story, is to simply let Jesus come in and drive out all of those things And we do so by just resting in His presence. Coming to prayer and not feeling the need to say anything. And coming to prayer and not feeling the need to think or not think. Let your thoughts wander where they may, because God is not going to wander anywhere. And even if you cannot feel like you're fully present to this time of prayer and this space, it doesn't matter. God is still fully present to you. And even when you don't feel like you're a very good mystic or a very good contemplative or you're very good at praying, it doesn't matter. The Holy Spirit is still praying through you, in you. And even when you feel like you're far from God, it doesn't matter. God is never far from you.